Hello, dear readers. Welcome to another literary journey that will transport us through time and space. Today, I invite you to embark with me on a story that transcends epochs, a narrative from 1881 that echoes eternal truths about love, dignity, and the courage to be authentic in a world that forces us to wear masks. Where are you watching from? Comment below with your city, state, or country. I love getting to know my audience and learning how our stories travel around the world. Now allow me to open the curtains of time. Year 1881, Bahia Azul Ranch, Argentine Patagonia. The harshest winter in decades covered the Patagonian vastness with its mantle of ice and silence, where destinies would intertwine like the threads of a tapestry woven by time itself. The March dawn arrived like a cold blade cutting through the darkness of the room. Isidora Echeverria awakened with her heart already heavy, sensing that something had changed during the night. The silence of the family home was different, not the silence of sleep, but the emptiness left by an absence. Her bare feet touched the cold floor as she rose to check the room next door. Celeste's bed was untouched, the covers still folded to perfection. On the pillow, a letter in her younger sister's hurried handwriting. "Forgive me, Isidora. I cannot marry a man I do not love. I have gone to find my destiny far from here." The wedding dress hanging in the wardrobe seemed like a sentence, ivory lace worked by hand by the convent nuns, an heirloom that should seal the union between the Echeverria and Del Solar families. Now it was just a ghost of silk and shattered hopes. Isidora's mother appeared in the doorway, her eyes red from contained tears. "She has abandoned us, daughter. The wedding is today, and without it." Her voice broke. "Your father's debts, the farm's mortgage, Aurelio del Solar will not accept cancellation. He is known for his harshness." Isidora knew what was not being said. She knew the stories about the man Celeste was supposed to marry, Aurelio del Solar, the most feared rancher in the region, owner of lands that extended as far as the eye could reach. They said his green eyes had the coldness of eternal ice, and that his word was absolute law in his domains. "You must take her place," her mother whispered, the words falling like drops of molten lead. "You are the eldest. You have the right to sacrifice." Isidora stared at the dress she had never imagined wearing. At 26, she had resigned herself to spinsterhood, finding purpose in books and caring for the house. She was the forgotten daughter, the one who always remained in the shadow of Celeste's radiant beauty. "He will notice I am not her," she murmured, but her voice already carried acceptance of the inevitable. "The veil will cover your face until the moment of vows. After." Her mother did not complete the sentence, but both knew that after would be too late to turn back. The dress slipped over her body like cold water. The lace sleeves embraced her arms with the delicacy of an unfulfilled promise. In the mirror, Isidora saw the reflection of a woman about to disappear, replaced by a fabricated version of herself. The heavy veil covered her chestnut hair, hiding the face that in a few hours would be revealed to a stranger who expected to receive another woman. Isidora breathed deeply, perhaps savoring the last moments when she was still herself. Outside, the carriage waited under the snow that was beginning to fall, each flake like a frozen tear from heaven. The wind howled among the bare trees, as if nature itself lamented what was to come. How could a woman surrender her identity in exchange for her family's salvation? And what kind of man awaited her in the frozen lands of Patagonia? The chapel of Santa Rosa rose solitary on the hilltop, its dark stone walls contrasting with the immaculate white of the snow. Centennial cypresses stood guard around the small temple, their branches twisted by the Patagonian wind, like arthritic fingers pointing to the grey sky. The storm had intensified during the journey, and when the carriage finally stopped before the chapel, Isidora could barely distinguish the silhouettes waiting. The wind whipped the veil against her face, as if trying to tear it off before time. Through the dark lace, she glimpsed an imposing figure at the chapel entrance. Tall, dressed entirely in black, Aurelio del Solar seemed to have been sculpted from the same somber stone as the building. Even at a distance, Isidora could feel the intensity of his gaze, two green points shining like cold stars in the storm. The priest, a small nervous man, made hurried gestures for the ceremony to begin. Besides him, only a few servants, a scribe, and 2 witnesses comprised the assembly. There was no music, no flowers, only the sound of wind lashing the chapel windows like a dark omen. Isidora walked down the central aisle, each step echoing in the sacred silence. Her hands trembled, not only from the cold, but from the weight of the lie she carried. With each meter closer to the altar, she felt as if she were burying more deeply the woman she had always been. Aurelio del Solar did not take his eyes off her during the entire walk. There was something disturbing in that gaze, not exactly hostility, but an intensity that seemed to want to decipher secrets through the veil. Isidora prayed silently that the lace would be thick enough to hide not only her face, but her terrified soul. When she finally reached the altar, the man beside her radiated a presence that seemed to fill the entire space. He was taller than she had imagined, with broad shoulders that spoke of years working the land. His hands, when they took hers for the vows, were rough but firm, hands that knew both the delicacy needed for planting and the strength to tame. "Do you take Celeste Echeverria as your wife, to love and respect her all the days of your life?" The priest's voice seemed to come from far away. "I do." Aurelio's voice was deep, resonating like distant thunder. When it was Isidora's turn to respond, her voice came out as a barely audible whisper. "I do." The moment of the nuptial kiss arrived, with the inevitability of an avalanche. Aurelio raised his hands to lift the veil, and Isidora closed her eyes, preparing for the moment when her farce would be discovered. But he only lightly touched her lips with his, a chaste, formal kiss that lasted only the time necessary to fulfill the ritual. When she opened her eyes, she saw that he was observing her with an indecipherable expression. For a moment, it seemed that something had changed in his gaze, but the flickering candlelight made it difficult to be sure. "It is done," declared the priest, his voice almost lost in the wind's howl. The storm reached its peak when they left the chapel. Aurelio covered Isidora with his cloak, a gesture that would have been gallant in other circumstances, but now seemed merely practical. During the journey to the ranch, he remained silent, looking through the carriage window at the white landscape that stretched infinitely. Isidora studied his profile in the glass's reflection. There was a severe beauty in that face, a harmony between strength and refinement that spoke of noble lineage, but it was the expression in his eyes that intrigued her, as if he carried secrets as heavy as hers. The Bahia Azul ranch emerged from the storm like a ghost ship sailing on a white sea. The main house of stone and wood stretched majestically against the dark sky. Observation towers flanked the construction, and an imposing portico promised shelter from the elements. But what kind of shelter would a woman living under an identity that was not hers find there? And how long would it take for the truth to come to light? The hall of the Bahia Azul ranch exuded an aroma of aged wood and beeswax. Heavy tapestries adorned the walls, depicting hunting scenes and Patagonian landscapes. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows that seemed to bring life to the portraits of the Del Solar ancestors. Aurelio walked directly to the library, where a goblet of red wine awaited him on a mahogany table. Only then did he turn to Isidora, who remained standing in the center of the hall, still wrapped in her wedding cloak. "You may remove the veil now," he said, his voice echoing in the ample space. "We are home." The words carried a strange formality, as if they were strangers fulfilling a social protocol. Isidora hesitated for a moment, knowing this would be the moment of truth. With trembling hands, she raised the veil and let it slip through her hair. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Aurelio studied her face with the same intensity with which a sculptor examines a block of marble, looking for the hidden lines of the work he intends to create. His green eyes traveled over every feature, the brown eyes where Celeste had blue ones, the darker hair, the more serene expression where her sister carried restless vivacity. "You are not Celeste Echeverria," he said finally, not as a question, but as a statement. Isidora felt the ground move beneath her feet. She began, but her voice died in her throat. "Celeste has a birthmark on her neck, on the left side, and her eyes had the color of summer sky." Aurelio took a step forward, without hostility, but with an almost scientific curiosity. "Who are you?" The confession burst from Isidora like water from a broken dam. "I am Isidora Echeverria, Celeste's sister. She fled during the night. Our family would face ruin if the marriage did not take place. I took her place." She expected screams, recriminations, perhaps even violence. Instead, Aurelio walked to the window and observed the snow that continued falling. "Why did you do it?" "Because it was the right thing to do," Isidora responded, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "My family depended on this marriage. I could not leave them in misery because of Celeste's cowardice." "Cowardice?" Aurelio turned to face her. "Perhaps she was the most courageous of you two, fleeing instead of facing a loveless marriage." The words hit Isidora like a blow, but she maintained her composure. "Perhaps, but I made the choice that seemed most honorable to me." Aurelio studied her for a long moment before returning to his table and taking the wine goblet. "Honor," he repeated, as if savoring the word. "A rare quality these days." "What will happen now?" asked Isidora, preparing herself for any fate. "Now," said Aurelio, drinking slowly, "we will establish the rules of our situation. You offered me honesty by confessing who you really are. In return, I offer you civility." Isidora did not know if this was a sentence or salvation. "We will sleep separately," he continued. "You will receive the South Tower room. You will have freedom to move about the house and property, but you will not attempt to flee. In public, we will maintain the appearances of a normal marriage." "And in private?" The question escaped before she could contain it. Aurelio looked at her with an indecipherable expression. "In private, we will be two strangers who share a name and a roof, nothing more." The elderly servant who appeared in the doorway, Remedios, as Aurelio introduced her, led Isidora to her room. The South Tower offered a spectacular view of the snowy plain, but there was a coldness in the air that did not come only from the climate. Alone finally, Isidora approached the window and observed the white vastness that extended beyond the horizon. She had traded her identity for security, but what kind of life would this be, living under a name that did not belong to her, married to a man who tolerated her only out of courtesy? Below, she saw Aurelio walking through the courtyard, his dark figure standing out against the snow. Even at a distance, he carried a loneliness that echoed her own. Two strangers united by a deception and separated by truth. Could something beyond mere convenience be born from this impossible situation? The first days at the ranch passed like blank pages of a book that had not yet found its story. Isidora established a silent routine. She woke with the first ray of sun that managed to penetrate the heavy clouds, dressed in the simple dresses that Remedios had provided, and wandered through the house like a ghost seeking its place in the world of the living. The South Tower had become her refuge. From the high window she could observe the ranch's movement without participating in it. The peons caring for the cattle, Patrizio, the foreman, giving orders with firm gestures, and Aurelio walking through the fields with the posture of someone born to command lands and men. Remedios, a 60-year-old woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, treated her with respectful but distant courtesy. During meals she served in silence, her dark eyes observing everything but revealing nothing. It was as if the entire ranch was suspended in a pause, waiting for something indefinite to happen. Aurelio kept his word about civility. During dinner, which they shared in the main dining room, he made polite inquiries about her day, commented on the weather or ranch matters. Their conversations were courteous, but empty of intimacy, like two travelers sharing a table at an inn. It was during one of these silent meals that Isidora noticed details she had missed in the first days. The house, for all its grandeur, carried signs of neglect. Curtains faded by the sun, furniture that needed polishing, broken objects abandoned in dark corners. It was as if life had gradually withdrawn from those rooms, leaving only the empty structure of a residence. "May I ask about the linen room?" she said on a Thursday, when the dinner silence had become particularly oppressive. Aurelio raised his eyes from his plate. "What about it? I saw there are piles of sheets and towels without repair. If you permit me, I could organize them." He studied her for a moment. "It's not necessary. Remedios takes care of the house." "Of course," Isidora replied, but she had noticed that Remedios, for all her dedication, was overburdened caring for such a vast property alone. The next morning, Isidora found herself walking to the linen room, even without permission. The aroma of lavender and rosemary permeated the air, but the disorganized piles told a story of years of neglect. She began separating the pieces that needed repair, her hands finding a familiar rhythm in the work. She was concentrated mending a linen sheet when Aurelio appeared in the doorway. He stood observing in silence for several minutes before speaking. I did not give you permission to touch these things. Isadora did not stop sewing. No, you did not. Why are you doing this? She finally raised her eyes to meet his. Because I need to do something that matters, even if it's small. There was something in the simplicity of her response that seemed to disarm him. Aurelio took a few steps into the room, observing the organized piles with an efficiency he had not seen in years. Your sister never showed interest in domestic work, he commented, almost to himself. Celeste always thought this kind of work was beneath her, Isadora replied, a touch of sadness coloring her voice. I always found there was dignity in caring for things. Aurelio remained there for a few more moments before leaving without saying anything else. But that night, during dinner, he did not reprimand her about the linen room. It was small progress, but progress nonetheless. The following days established a new pattern. Isadora woke early and cared for small repairs around the house, mending curtains, organizing the pantry, polishing forgotten furniture. It was not work that had been ordered of her, but something she chose to do, a way of claiming a space in that world where she was just an intruder. At night, she discovered Aurelio's library, high shelves loaded with books in Spanish, English, and French, volumes on agriculture, history, literature. She discreetly borrowed works of philosophy and poetry, always returning them to the exact place where she had found them. It was thus that he found her one night, sitting in a leather armchair reading Jane Austen's Persuasion by candlelight. That is one of my favorites, he said from the doorway. Isadora almost dropped the book. Forgive me, I did not think you would mind. I don't mind. Aurelio walked to the fireplace and stirred the fire. It has been a long time since these books had company. It was the first time he had shown anything beyond cold courtesy. Isadora closed the book carefully. It is a story about second chances, she said. Yes, he agreed, looking at the flames. It is about people who discover that we do not always receive what we expect, but sometimes we receive what we need. Could that conversation in the library be the first thread of a real connection being woven between two hearts that had resigned themselves to solitude? The letter arrived on an April morning, delivered by a messenger who had ridden 3 days through the storm. Aurelio read it in his library, the fireplace crackling softly while his eyes traveled over the lines written in Celeste's hurried calligraphy. Dear Aurelio, when this letter reaches your hands, you will already know that it was not I who said yes at the altar. My sister Isadora took my place because I did not have the courage to face an arranged marriage. I know it may seem cruel, but believe me, it was not out of disrespect for you, but because I know my own nature. Isadora is different from me. Where I am tempest, she is calm. Where I seek passion, she finds contentment in simplicity. Perhaps you have received who deserves more than who was promised. She is one of those women who know how to stay, while I always only knew how to leave. I do not ask forgiveness for my choice, but I hope you find in her company something I could never have offered. Celeste Echeverria. Aurelio folded the letter slowly, his fingers tracing the paper's edges, as if he could extract more truths from the words. There was a brutal honesty in Celeste's confession that echoed the same quality he had recognized in Isadora. That afternoon, he found Isadora in the small room adjacent to the kitchen, where Emilio, one of the younger peons, lay with fever. The 17-year-old had contracted pneumonia working in the cold, and Remedios was overwhelmed with her other obligations. Isadora was sitting beside the bed, passing a damp cloth over the young man's forehead. Her sleeves were rolled up, and there was a gentle concentration in her movements that spoke of care born from compassion, not duty. How is he? Asked Aurelio from the doorway. The fever decreased during the afternoon, she replied without raising her eyes from the patient. But he will need constant care for the next few days. Aurelio observed her work. There was a naturalness in her gestures, a patience that came from genuine concern for the boy's well-being. Remedios had commented that Isadora had spent the previous night there, checking Emilio's temperature hour by hour. You don't need to do this, he said. Remedios can care for him. She already has too much work, Isadora replied, finally looking at him. And I like feeling useful. There was a melancholy in her voice that touched something deep in Aurelio's chest. She was not caring for the boy out of obligation, but because she found purpose in alleviating others' suffering. Celeste wrote, he said abruptly. Isadora's hands paused over Emilio's forehead. What did she say? That perhaps I received who deserves more than who was promised. The blush that rose in Isadora's cheeks was almost imperceptible in the candle's golden light, but Aurelio noticed. "Celeste was always generous with words," she murmured. "And you? Are you generous only with actions?" The question hung in the air between them. Isadora returned her attention to Emilio, but Aurelio perceived the almost invisible tremor in her hands. "Actions are more reliable than words," she said finally. "Words can lie. Actions reveal who we really are." Aurelio remained there for a few more minutes, observing her care for the boy with a dedication he had not expected to find. When he finally withdrew, he paused at the door and looked back. "Isadora," he said, using her true name for the first time. She raised her eyes, surprised. "Thank you for caring for him." Later that night, when Aurelio made his final round of the ranch, he found Isadora still in Emilio's room, asleep in the chair beside the bed. The uncomfortable position had made her head tilt to one side, and strands of hair had escaped from her simple hairstyle. Without making noise, he went to fetch a blanket from his own room. He returned and covered her carefully, taking care not to wake her. For a moment he stood there, observing the serene expression of her face in sleep. There was a quiet beauty in Isadora that he had not noticed before. Not Celeste's dramatic beauty, but something more subtle, like the difference between a spectacular sunset and the golden light of dawn. A beauty that grew with observation, revealing layers of depth for those who had patience to look. When he left the room, he carried with him the image of her sleeping beside the sick boy, and for the first time since the wedding, he felt something move in his chest that was not just courtesy or duty. Could that small gesture of care be the first crack in the wall of ice that both had built around their hearts? Spring arrived timidly to Patagonia, like a wary child peering through the door of an unfamiliar room. The snow began to recede, revealing patches of dark earth and promises of new life dormant beneath winter's crust. It was during one of these thawing mornings that Isadora discovered the abandoned garden. It was located in the eastern part of the ranch, protected by a low stone wall and a little rusty iron gate. When she pushed the door, the hinge's squeak echoed like a lament for the years of neglect. What had once been a formal garden was now a cemetery of plants. Wild rose bushes had grown without pruning, their intertwined branches forming thorny barriers. Weeds choked the flower beds that once followed precise geometric patterns. A central fountain, ornamented with marble cherubs, was dry and full of dead leaves. But beneath the abandonment, Isadora could see the bones of something that had been beautiful. The garden's structure was still there. The stone paths, the flower bed design, the thoughtful arrangement to capture the best sunlight. It was like finding a palimpsest, where previous beauty could still be read through layers of neglect. During the following days, she began working in the garden without asking permission. She brought borrowed tools from the shed, a small hoe, pruning shears, a rake. Working in the earth brought her a peace she had not found since arriving at the ranch. Kneeling among the flower beds, removing weeds with her bare hands, she felt connected to something greater than her own solitude. Each root pulled, each branch pruned, each stone replaced was an act of faith in the possibility of renewal. It was thus that Aurelio found her one May afternoon, on her knees in the muddy ground, her hands dirty with earth, removing a patch of nettles that had grown around an old rose bush. She was so concentrated on the work that she did not hear him approach. "That garden has not been used for years," he said, making her startle. Isadora turned, still kneeling, a smudge of earth on her face where she had passed her hand. "I know. That's why I thought that perhaps I could—" Her voice trailed off, conscious that once again she had assumed a task without permission. "It was my mother's garden," Aurelio continued, walking closer. "She died when I was 15. My father could never bear to look at it after that." There was an old pain in his voice, a wound that time had scarred but not completely healed. Isadora stood slowly, cleaning her hands on her apron. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. If you prefer that I stop—" "No," he said quickly, surprising them both. "Don't stop. It's good to see life returning to this place." They stood in silence for a few moments, observing the work she had begun. Only a small section had been cleaned, but the difference was notable. The original outlines of the flower beds were beginning to emerge like a drawing being revealed. "Did she plant roses?" asked Isadora softly. "White roses. She said they were symbols of new beginnings." Aurelio walked to the rosebush she was freeing. This one here was the first she planted. It always bloomed only once a year, at the beginning of summer. Isadora approached the plant. Even wild and uncared for, she could see there was vigorous life running through its branches. "It can still bloom," she said. "It just needs care." "How do you know?" "My grandmother had a garden. She taught me that plants are like people. Even when they seem lost, there is always hope for renewal if someone is willing to care." Aurelio observed her profile while she spoke, noting the contained passion in her voice. There was a particular beauty in the way she touched the rosebush's branches, as if she could feel life pulsing through the wood. "You are bleeding," he said suddenly. Isadora looked down and saw that a thorn had cut her left palm. Blood flowed between her fingers, staining the dark earth. Without hesitation, Aurelio took his handkerchief and held her hand to stanch the blood. The touch was surprisingly gentle for hands so large and rough. Isadora felt the warmth of his fingers against her skin, and something stirred in her chest. "It's just a scratch," she murmured, but did not withdraw her hand. "Small wounds can be the most dangerous," he replied, his eyes meeting hers for the first time with something beyond courtesy. For a moment it seemed the world had stopped. The breeze carried the aroma of damp earth and spring promises. The blood on Isadora's hand had stopped flowing, but Aurelio still held her fingers between his. It was Isadora who should have pulled away first, but it was Aurelio who released her hand abruptly, as if he had awakened from a trance. "Remedios can take proper care of that," he said, his voice returning to its usual formal tone. "Of course," she replied, conscious that something had changed in those few seconds of contact. When he walked away, Isadora remained alone in the garden, observing the blood-stained handkerchief in her hand. It was just a piece of cloth, but it carried his warmth and scent, an involuntary intimacy that made her heart race. An accidental touch had planted a seed of possibility. But would flowers born in uncertain soil resist the storms that were yet to come? The copy of Persuasion appeared on her room's table one June morning, without explanation or note. Isadora found it upon returning from the garden, where she had spent the morning pruning dead branches from the old rosebush. The book was open to the page, where Anne Elliot reflected on second chances and loves that bloom at the right time. There was no doubt who had left it there. It was the same volume she had seen Aurelio reading in the library several nights before, with marks in the margins and pages folded at the corners, signs of a beloved and oft reread book. During dinner that night, Isadora did not mention the gift, nor did he. But there was a silent understanding between them, a conversation being maintained through unspoken gestures. When she commented on the garden's progress, he listened with genuine attention. When he spoke about preparations for sheep shearing, she asked intelligent questions that showed real interest. Emilio had completely recovered from pneumonia, and his gratitude to Isadora was evident in every smile and wave when he saw her. The young man had begun helping her in the garden during his free hours, carrying heavy stones and digging holes for new plantings. "You have given new life to that place," said Remedios one morning, while they prepared bread together in the kitchen. It was the first time the servant had made a personal comment about anything, and Isadora felt touched by the approval. "There is still much work to do," she replied, kneading the dough with rhythmic movements. "Don Aurelio has been visiting the garden every day," Remedios observed casually. He had not stepped foot there for more than 10 years. The information made Isadora's heart race, but she maintained a serene expression. It's natural that he would want to monitor the progress. Was all Remedios said, but there was a knowing smile in her eyes. That same afternoon, Isadora was watering the flower beds when she heard approaching footsteps. She turned expecting to see Emilio, but it was Aurelio walking along the stone path, carrying something in his hands. "I brought this for you," he said, extending a small ceramic pot. Inside, a lavender cutting displayed its grey-green leaves. "I thought you might like it." It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. He had thought of her, chosen something especially for her, taken the time to bring it personally. "It's beautiful," said Isadora, receiving the pot carefully. "Where should I plant it?" "Wherever you think best. The garden is yours now." The words carried more weight than they seemed on the surface. It was not just about the garden, it was about belonging, about having a place that was hers in a world where she had arrived as an intruder. They planted the lavender together, Aurelio digging the hole while Isadora prepared the roots. They worked in comfortable silence, their hands occasionally brushing when they passed tools to each other. "My mother said lavender was for protection," he commented while covering the roots with earth, "and to attract happiness. Your mother was a wise woman." "She was." Aurelio stood, cleaning his hands on his pants. "I think she would have liked you." It was the most personal thing he had shared since they met, and Isadora felt a wave of emotion that surprised her. "Why do you think that?" "Because you see beauty where others see only work. Like her." That night Isadora found another surprise. A white rose on her pillow with a long stem and perfect petals. There were still dewdrops on its leaves, indicating it had been recently cut. She took the flower to the window and observed the garden illuminated by the full moon. The rose bush she had been caring for rose in the center of the main flower bed, and even from a distance she could see that buds were forming on its branches. The next day she found Patrizio working near the garden and could not resist her curiosity. "The old rose bush, does it usually bloom?" she asked. The foreman, a man of few words, stopped his work and looked at the plant. "Once a year, at the height of summer. Always a single rose, white as snow." He observed her for a moment. "Don Aurelio must have cut the first one for you." Isadora felt heat rise up her neck. "First?" "Yes. When I was leaving to check the cattle this morning, I saw him in the garden cutting something from the rose bush. First time in years I've seen that plant show signs of life." Isadora's heart beat faster. The rose had not been a casual impulse. Aurelio had gone out of his routine to go to the garden, had carefully chosen the gift, had broken a tradition of years to give her the first flower from that special rose bush. That afternoon, while working in the garden, she found a small wooden plaque buried near the rose bush. When she cleaned it, she could read the engraved inscription, "In memory of Elena del Solar, who planted beauty where she found only earth." For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Isadora felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness, but from a complex emotion that mixed gratitude, hope, and something she did not yet dare to name. A white rose had been offered, symbol of new beginnings and pure love. But would it be enough to bloom true passion in the hearts of two beings who had learned to protect themselves behind walls of caution? The first September storm arrived without warning, transforming the pleasant afternoon into chaos of wind and rain. Isadora was in the library when the first thunder echoed through the house, making the windows tremble in their frames. Aurelio appeared in the doorway shortly after, his hair damp and shirt stained with rain. "The servants are closing the upper floor windows," he said. "This part of the house is safer during storms." It was the first time they had been alone in the library since that night when she had found him reading. The fireplace was lit, casting a golden glow over the book-laden shelves, creating an atmosphere of involuntary intimacy. "You don't need to stay here if you don't want to," said Isadora, conscious that she was invading his personal space. "This is your home too," he replied, walking to the fireplace to stir the fire. "Even if you arrived by unconventional paths." There was something different in his voice, a softness that was not present in their usual conversations. Perhaps it was the storm's effect, isolating them from the rest of the world, or perhaps it was the months of respectful coexistence finally creating space for something deeper. "Do you regret it?" he asked abruptly, without looking at her. "Taking Celeste's place?" The question caught her off guard. Isadora closed the book she was reading and considered the answer carefully. "I don't regret having protected my family," she said finally. "But sometimes I wonder who I would be if I had had a choice. And who do you think you would be?" It was a question that haunted her on sleepless nights. Perhaps someone invisible forever, a spinster caring for her parents until they grew old, reading borrowed books and finding purpose in small things. "You see yourself as invisible?" The vulnerability in her voice made her look at him directly. "I always was. Celeste was the beautiful one, the desired one. I was just the one who stayed." Aurelio turned to face her, the firelight illuminating his profile. "Perhaps you confused invisibility with discretion. They are very different things." "What is the difference?" "Invisible people don't leave marks. You transform everything you touch. The garden, the house, the people around you. That is not invisibility." The compliment hit her like a warm wave, undoing defenses she didn't know she had erected. "Do you really believe that?" I believe you have made me question many things I thought I knew about myself. It was the most intimate confession he had made, and Isadora felt the air between them charge with possibilities. The storm outside seemed to amplify the library's quietude, creating a private world where only they existed. Like what? She asked softly. Aurelio walked to the window, observing the rain lashing the glass. I believed marriage was just a practical contract. That companionship was enough for a lifetime. That love was a luxury men like me could not afford. And now? Now I realized that perhaps I had been afraid of the wrong thing. What were you afraid of? He turned to her, and for the first time since they met, she saw complete honesty in his green eyes. I was afraid of becoming vulnerable, of letting someone get close enough to hurt me. And what are you afraid of now? Now I'm afraid it might be too late to change. That I've wasted so much time keeping distance that I no longer know how to let someone get close. The rain continued beating against the windows, but for Isadora, the sound had become background music to a revelation that changed everything. She rose from the armchair and walked to him, stopping just a few steps away. It's not too late, she said, her voice just a whisper. It's never too late to choose to be brave. For a moment they looked at each other in silence, the space between them charged with tension and possibility. The firelight danced on their faces, creating shadows that seemed to tell stories of all the unspoken words and all the contained gestures. Isadora, he said, her name sounding different on his lips, loaded with a tenderness she had never heard before. Yes, you are not who I expected to find at the altar that day. I know. But perhaps you are exactly who I needed to find. The confession hung between them like a delicate bridge, waiting to see if it would be crossed or if it would crumble under the weight of its own possibilities. In the safety of the library, protected by the storm from the outside world, two hearts were finally beginning to admit the truth that had been growing silently between them. But would courage be enough to transform a forced union into a true choice? The sound of galloping hooves arrived on an October morning, when the air finally carried promises of true spring. Isadora was in the garden, admiring the buds forming on Elena's rosebush, when the sound made her look toward the road that serpentined across the plain. A carriage was approaching at dangerous speed, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. Even from a distance, there was something in the urgency of that arrival that sent a chill down her spine. Aurelio appeared beside her, attracted by the same sound. His eyes narrowed when he recognized the carriage, a rented vehicle, not one of the familiar carriages from the region. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked. "No," Isadora replied, but her heart already suspected who might be in that carriage. When the vehicle finally stopped before the main house, the door opened before the coachman could even dismount. Celeste Echeverria emerged in an avalanche of wrinkled skirts and disheveled hair, her blue eyes scanning the property with a mixture of desperation and determination. She was very different from the radiant young woman who had fled months before. Her skin was pale, there were dark circles under her eyes, and her clothes, though still elegant, showed signs of difficult travel and limited resources. "Isadora!" she shouted upon seeing her sister, running toward the garden with an urgency that alarmed Isadora. The embrace Celeste gave her was desperate, like someone drowning clutching a lifeboat. "Oh, my sister, you cannot imagine how happy I am to see you." Isadora returned the embrace, but over Celeste's shoulder, her eyes met Aurelio's. There was a tension in his face that she could not decipher. Surprise, irritation, perhaps even a hint of jealousy. "Celeste, what are you doing here?" she asked gently, pulling her sister away to study her face. I made terrible mistakes, Isadora. I need help." Celeste's eyes filled with genuine tears. "I have no one else to turn to." It was then that she seemed to really notice Aurelio for the first time. Her eyes widened upon recognizing him, and a complex mixture of emotions passed over her face: guilt, embarrassment, and perhaps a hint of the automatic charm she had always used with men. "Aurelio," she said, making an awkward curtsy. I know I have no right to be here after what I did." "Indeed, you do not," he replied, his voice cutting like ice. "Explain yourself." The story came out in pieces, between tears and pauses to breathe. Celeste had fled with an army lieutenant, a married man who had promised to leave his wife to be with her. They had gone to Buenos Aires, where he had installed her in a small apartment and bought her clothes and jewelry. "I thought I was living a great romance," whispered Celeste, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I believed all his promises, but after 3 months the lieutenant had disappeared one night, taking with him the most valuable jewelry and leaving only a cold note explaining that he had returned to his family. Celeste found herself alone, without money, with growing debts and impatient landlords. I tried to work, I swear I tried," she continued, "but a woman in my situation, the only opportunities available were—" Her voice died, but the implication was clear. "How did you get here?" asked Aurelio, his tone still cold but without the initial harshness. "I sold the last pieces I had left to pay for passage, and now—" She looked desperately at Isadora. "There are men looking for me. Creditors. Some of the type that don't accept excuses." Isadora felt her heart break for her sister, but also a stab of fear. Celeste's situation was dangerous not only for her, but potentially for everyone at the ranch. "You can stay," said Isadora before Aurelio could speak, "but with conditions." The relief on Celeste's face was palpable. "Anything, sister. Anything. You will stay in the servants' house attic. Not in the main room, not as a special guest. You will help with housework and respect Aurelio's rules." Celeste nodded vigorously, but Isadora caught the flash of irritation that passed through her eyes upon hearing about the attic. "And most importantly," continued Isadora, her voice gaining a firmness that surprised even herself, "you will not cause problems between me and my husband. This is my home now, and these are my rules." The word husband carried a new weight when Isadora pronounced it, a claim that had not been there before. Aurelio looked at her with surprise and perhaps a touch of pride. Of course," murmured Celeste, but there was something in her eyes that suggested the submission would only be temporary. That night, during dinner, Celeste's presence completely changed the table's dynamics. She tried to resume her natural charm, asking questions about the ranch, praising Remedios's cooking, commenting on the improvements that Isadora had made to the house. But there was something calculated in her performance, as if she were testing the waters, looking for cracks in the structure that Isadora and Aurelio had built. "It's fascinating how well you've adapted here, Isadora," she said at one point, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I always thought you weren't adventurous enough for country life. Sometimes we discover strengths we didn't know we had," Isadora replied calmly. "Yes, especially when we have no choice," Celeste replied, and there was a subtle sting in her words. Celeste's arrival had disturbed the delicate balance that Isadora and Aurelio had been building. Could their nascent love survive the test of having the past literally knocking at their door? The letter arrived on a cloudy November morning, delivered discreetly by a village boy who left before anyone could ask questions. The envelope had no sender, only Aurelio's name written in handwriting that tried to disguise its origin. Aurelio read the letter in the privacy of his library, and Isadora knew immediately that something was wrong from the expression she found on his face when she came down for breakfast. "We need to talk," he said, his voice loaded with a tension she had not heard in months. In the library, he handed her the letter without preamble. "Dear Mr. Del Sola, it is my duty to inform you that your wife is not who she claims to be. The woman living in your house, Celeste Echeverria, is, in fact, her sister Isadora. The real Celeste fled on the eve of the wedding and abandoned everyone. You have been deceived by a family of liars who thought they could make a fool of you, a friend concerned with your honor." Isadora's hands trembled when she returned the paper. "Who would write something like this?" "Someone who knows the truth and wants to use it as a weapon," Aurelio replied, walking to the window. "The question is, who else knows besides us?" "Celeste," Isadora began, but stopped. Despite all her faults, it was hard to believe her sister capable of such betrayal, or someone she told. Aurelio turned to face her, and for the first time in weeks, there was distance in his eyes. "Isadora, this changes everything." "Why?" The question came out more defensive than she intended. "You already knew who I was. Nothing has changed between us. Nothing has changed between us, but now someone else knows. And if one letter came, others may come. To authorities, to neighbors, to anyone who wants to use this information against me." The implication of his words hit her like a blow. "How you're saying I've become a risk to you? I'm saying our situation just became much more complicated. Before Isidora could respond, Patricio appeared in the doorway with a grave expression. "Don Aurelio, there's a man here who wants to speak with you. Says it's about an urgent matter related to your marriage." The man waiting in the main room was Esteban Reinaldi, a smaller rancher from the region who had courted Celeste unsuccessfully 2 years before. He was a thin man with small eyes and a well-trimmed mustache, known for his avarice and for holding grudges. "Aurelio," he said with an oily smile, "good to see you. And this must be your wife." The way he said the word wife made it clear he knew exactly who she was. "What do you want, Esteban?" asked Aurelio, his voice dangerously low. "Just to check on the welfare of an old friend." Esteban smiled at Isidora with poorly disguised malice. "Celeste was always special to me. I'm happy to know she finally settled so appropriately." "Say what you came to say and leave," Aurelio ordered. "Very well. I have received interesting information about your wife's identity. Information that, I'm sure, would greatly interest the provincial authorities, considering that fraudulent marriage is a serious crime." Isidora felt her blood freeze in her veins, but Aurelio stepped forward, his physical presence threatening. "Are you accusing my wife of fraud?" "I'm not accusing anyone," said Esteban, backing away slightly. "Just offering my discretion in exchange for adequate compensation." It was blackmail, pure and simple. Esteban wanted money in exchange for keeping quiet about Isidora's identity. "Get off my property," said Aurelio, his voice so cold it almost froze the air. "Now, think carefully, Aurelio. One word from me, and the entire province will know you were made a fool by 2 women. Your reputation, your business, everything could crumble." "Get out!" Aurelio's shout echoed through the entire house. Esteban left quickly, but not before casting one last malicious look at Isidora. When they were alone, the silence was deafening. Aurelio paced back and forth like a caged animal, while Isidora remained motionless, processing the magnitude of what had happened. "He's going to spread the story anyway," she said finally. "Probably. Then we have to get ahead of it." Isidora took a deep breath, making a decision that would change everything. "I'm going to tell the truth to everyone at the ranch, right now." "Isidora, no. Yes. If it's going to come out anyway, let it be from my mouth with my words." That afternoon, Isidora gathered all the ranch workers in the main courtyard. Remedios, Patricio, Emilio, the cowboys, the servants. Everyone gathered in a semicircle, curious about the unusual summons. With a firm voice, she told the complete truth. Who she really was, why she had taken Celeste's place, how she had deceived everyone for months. She omitted nothing, did not try to justify her actions beyond the simple facts. When she finished, the silence was total. Then, to her surprise, it was Emilio who broke the quiet. "So you cared for me when I was sick," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "It doesn't matter what name you use, you're a good person." One by one, others began to speak. Remedios spoke about how Isidora had brought life back to the house. Patricio mentioned the improvements she had made. Others spoke about small kindnesses they had received from her. Finally, Aurelio climbed the porch steps to stand beside her. "Isidora Echeverria is my wife," he declared, his voice carrying absolute authority. "She is the Lady of Bahia Azul, and anyone who questions that will question me directly." The public support was overwhelming, but Isidora knew the real battle was just beginning. Esteban would not give up easily, and now the truth was loose in the world. The truth had been revealed, but would the courage to face it be enough to protect the love that had grown in the darkness of deception? And what price would they have to pay for honesty? The weeks following the public revelation passed in contained tension, as if the entire ranch was holding its breath, waiting for the storm that might or might not come. Esteban Reinaldi had not appeared again, but his threat hung over them like a storm cloud on the horizon. Paradoxically, it was during this period of uncertainty that Isidora and Aurelio grew closer than ever. So the forced honesty had brought down the last barriers between them, and for the first time since the wedding, they could simply be themselves. The evenings in the library became a sacred ritual. After dinner, they found themselves there naturally, she with a book, he with correspondence or simply watching the fire. They talked about everything, the books they read, childhood memories, the dreams they had nurtured when they believed life would follow different paths. It was on one of these nights, when December brought the promise of summer, that Aurelio asked the question that would change everything. "If you could choose again," he said, closing the accounting book he was reviewing, "if you could go back to that morning and make a different decision, what would you do?" Isadora marked the page of the poetry volume she was reading and closed it carefully. It was a question she had asked herself many times during the lonely months, but had never found an answer that satisfied her completely. "At first, I would have fled like Celeste," she said honestly. "I would have found another solution, any other solution. And now—" She rose from the armchair and walked to the window, observing the garden bathed in moonlight. Eleanor's rosebush was exuberant, covered with buds that would soon open in summer's glory. "Now I realize that perhaps I didn't come here by accident," she said softly. "Perhaps I came because it was where I needed to be." Aurelio also stood, approaching her until they were side by side before the window. "And I realized something too." "What?" "That I spent my whole life waiting for something I couldn't define. And when you arrived, not Celeste, but you, I knew immediately that was what had been missing." Isadora turned to face him, her heart racing with the intensity in his green eyes. "Aurelio, let me finish," he said, taking her hands in his. "You were not who I expected to find at the altar that day, but you were exactly who I should have always found." The words hung between them, loaded with all the truth they had danced around for months. "I'm saying I love you, Isadora," he continued, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Not out of duty, not for convenience, but because you brought light to corners of my soul I didn't even know existed." The confession was like a dam breaking. Isadora felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness but from a joy so pure it hurt. "I love you too," she whispered, the words coming out like a prayer. "I love your strength and your gentleness, your seriousness and the rare moments when you smile. I love who I became when I'm with you." The kiss that followed was not like the chaste kiss of the wedding ceremony. It was a meeting of souls that finally allowed themselves to recognize the truth that had been growing between them since the first true look. When they separated, they remained embraced, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, sharing the same space that now seemed sacred. "Marry me," said Aurelio, and although the phrase seemed absurd considering they were already married, Isadora understood perfectly what he meant. "Marry me for real this time," he continued, "not out of duty or necessity, but by choice, because we choose each other." "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "Yes to everything. To choice, to love, to whatever future we build together." The next day they held a private ceremony in the garden. Not an official ceremony, they were already legally married, but a personal ritual to mark the moment when their union transformed from obligation to celebration. Patrizio and Remedios served as witnesses, and Emilio brought wildflowers to decorate the space around Elena's rosebush. Celeste, who had observed their growing closeness with a mixture of jealousy and genuine happiness for her sister, was also present. Aurelio had prepared a small surprise. When the informal ceremony reached its end, he knelt beside the rosebush and planted a new cutting, another white rose mirror of the original. "To mark this day," he said, placing a small wooden stake beside the plant. "And to remember that sometimes the most beautiful things grow when we least expect them." Isadora read the inscription engraved on the stake. "To the woman I didn't expect, but should always have found, December 1881. That night, for the first time since they met, they slept in the same room. Not the South Tower room that had been Isadora's refuge, nor the main room that had belonged only to Aurelio, but a new space they transformed together, a place that was truly theirs. Love had finally found its voice and courage, but in a world where the past had the power to destroy the present, would it be strong enough to face any storm that was yet to come? The summer of 1882 arrived with an intensity that mirrored the passion that had bloomed between Isadora and Aurelio. The garden exploded in colors, Elena's white roses in their splendor, lavender perfuming the morning air, and the new rosebush they had planted together already showing its first buds. Celeste had found her place in the ranch's dynamics, working in the house and helping Remedios with the heavier tasks. Although there were still moments of tension when her impulsive nature clashed with the order Isadora had established, she seemed genuinely grateful for the second chance she had been offered. "You've changed," she said one afternoon, while they helped fold clothes in the yard. "Not just on the outside, but inside, there's Solidity in you that wasn't there before. Isadora smiled, thinking about the observation. Perhaps I just found where I belong. And Aurelio, he's changed too. He smiles more, laughs even. I never thought I'd see the day when Aurelio del Solar would laugh at one of Emilio's jokes. It was true. The severe man who had married her out of obligation had transformed into someone lighter, more willing to find joy in small moments. Just the night before, she had caught him teaching Emilio to play chess, his patience infinite, while the young man made the same mistakes repeatedly. But the happiness they had built was tested one January morning, when a provincial official arrived at the ranch with an investigation order. "We received a formal complaint," explained the man, a middle-aged captain with tired eyes and bureaucratic manners. "Allegations of matrimonial fraud, falsified documents, conspiracy to deceive authorities." Esteban Reinaldi had fulfilled his threat, but in a way neither Isadora nor Aurelio had anticipated. Instead of simply spreading rumors, he had filed an official complaint, forcing a legal investigation that could result in imprisonment and marriage annulment. "I will need to interrogate all involved parties," continued the official. "The bride, the groom, witnesses to the ceremony, family members. This is a serious matter." During the following 3 days, the ranch transformed into a kind of makeshift tribunal. The official conducted meticulous interviews, examined documents, questioned every person who had been present at the wedding. Isadora answered all questions with total honesty, not trying to hide or minimize what she had done. Yes, she had assumed her sister's identity. Yes, she had deceived the groom and the priest. No, there were no falsified documents. She simply had not corrected the assumption that she was Celeste. "Why did you do it?" asked the official. "To save my family from financial ruin," she replied, "and because I believed it was my duty." "And you did not consider the legal consequences?" "I considered only the consequences of doing nothing." Aurelio's interrogation was more tense. The official clearly expected to find an indignant victim, demanding justice against the woman who had deceived him. Instead, he found a man who defended his wife with unwavering fervor. "Your wife deceived you," said the official. "Don't you feel betrayed?" "My wife told me the truth at the first opportunity," Aurelio replied. "Any deception was temporary and was corrected with total honesty. But you did not receive who you expected to receive." "I received exactly who I needed to receive." The simplicity of the answer seemed to disconcert the official. It was clear he had come expecting to find a straightforward case of fraud, but was discovering a much more complex situation. The decisive moment came when the official asked to speak with Celeste. Isadora felt her stomach tighten, knowing that her sister's testimony could seal her fate. Celeste entered the room with erect posture and raised chin. All signs of submission disappeared. For a moment, Isadora saw flashes of the confident young woman her sister had been before her disastrous adventures. "Is it true that you should have married Mr. Del Solar?" asked the official. "It is true." "And why did you not marry?" "Because I fled like a coward the night before the wedding." The brutal honesty of the answer clearly surprised the official. "And your sister took your place without your knowledge or consent?" Celeste hesitated only for a moment before responding. "My sister did what I should have done. She honored the family's commitments when I failed. If there's anyone who should be punished here, it's me, not her." "But the legal question remains." "The legal question," interrupted Celeste, her voice gaining strength, "is that my sister saved 2 families from ruin, created a marriage that brought genuine happiness to 2 people, and transformed a commercial transaction into something beautiful. If that's a crime, then our laws are wrong." Isadora and Aurelio's fate now lay in the hands of an official who had the power to destroy everything they had built. Would the strength of their love be enough to convince the world that some lies serve greater truths? The official's decision came on a suffocating February afternoon when the air was so still that even the tree leaves seemed to hold their breath. He had spent an additional week investigating, sending telegrams to the capital, consulting legal precedents. Isadora and Aurelio waited in the library, their hands intertwined, prepared for any verdict. The morning had brought disturbing news. Esteban Reinaldi had been arrested in Ushuaia for document forgery and attempted blackmail against other ranchers in the region. Apparently, his attack against them was part of a larger pattern of criminal behavior. "Regardless of what he says," murmured Aurelio, squeezing her hand. "We'll face it together. And if he says our marriage is invalid, then we'll marry again, as many times as necessary, in every place that will recognize our union." When the official finally arrived, he brought with him a sealed envelope, his official decision that would be sent to the provincial authorities. "This is a unique case," he began, sitting in the armchair Aurelio had offered. "Technically, there was misrepresentation of identity. You were not who you claimed to be at the time of the ceremony." Isadora's heart sank, but she maintained a serene expression. "However," continued the official, "I found no evidence of criminal intent. There were no falsified documents, no planned conspiracy to defraud. It was a desperate decision made to protect the family, and the truth was revealed to the husband immediately after the ceremony." He opened the envelope and withdrew an official document. "Furthermore, the complainant, Mr. Reynaldi, has been arrested for crimes that cast serious doubt on his motivations in making this complaint." Isadora and Aurelio exchanged a quick glance, but remained silent. "Finally," said the official, studying them carefully, "I found something I had never seen in my 20 years investigating matrimonial disputes. A genuinely happy couple, devoted to each other." The pause that followed seemed to last an eternity. "My official recommendation to the provincial authorities is that this marriage be recognized as valid and legal." The bride revealed her true identity to the husband, who accepted her completely. There was no real victim, no damage caused, and the union resulted in genuine mutual benefit. Isadora felt tears well up, but this time they were tears of pure relief. Aurelio stood and extended his hand to the official. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Thank you for seeing the truth." "The truth," replied the official, shaking the offered hand, "is that true love is too rare in this world to be destroyed by legal technicalities." After the official's departure, Isadora and Aurelio walked to the garden in silence, needing fresh air and open space to process the magnitude of what had happened. Elena's rosebush was at its peak, covered with white flowers that seemed to float like terrestrial stars. The new rosebush they had planted had also bloomed, its flowers smaller but equally beautiful. "It's over," said Isadora, almost unable to believe it. "No," replied Aurelio, pulling her into his arms. "Now it's truly beginning." The kiss they shared was different from all the previous ones, not born from the passion of the moment or the tenderness of discovery, but from the absolute certainty that they had a future together, free from the shadows of the past. That night they made plans to expand the ranch, plans to travel together, plans for a family. For the first time since they met, they could speak of the future without fear of having it torn away from them. "There's something I want to do," said Isadora during a pause in their conversation. "What?" "I want to write to my mother, tell her everything that happened, how things developed. She needs to know that her daughter is truly happy." Aurelio smiled, kissing her forehead softly. "And I want to add a line at the end of the letter." "What do you want to say?" "I want to thank her for raising a daughter with enough courage to sacrifice her own happiness for the family, but more importantly, for raising a daughter who knew how to find happiness, even when it came disguised as sacrifice." The letter was written that same night, by candlelight in the library that had become the heart of their shared life. When they finished, they sealed it together, their hands touching as they pressed the hot wax. It was more than a letter. It was a declaration that they had survived the storm and emerged not just intact, but transformed into something stronger and more beautiful than either of them had dreamed of being alone. The battle for the legitimacy of their love had been won, but the true victory lay in the certainty that they had found something no law or social convention could touch. A love born from choice, tempered by adversity, and strengthened by truth. Bahia Azul Ranch, December 1889. The morning sun gilded the fields that stretched infinitely beyond the main house windows, now expanded and renovated over the years. Isadora woke, as she always did, to the soft sound of children's laughter coming from the garden. At 34, there was a serenity in her face that spoke of a woman who had found her place in the world. Her hair, now with some silver strands at the temples, was loose over her shoulders, and when she rose to look out the window, she smiled at the scene awaiting her. Esperanza, 8 years old, was running among the rose bushes with Constanza, 6, chasing a butterfly that danced among the flowers. The two girls had inherited their father's intense green eyes, but their mother's observant and gentle temperament. "They woke up early today," said Aurelio, approaching from behind and wrapping her in his arms. At 40, there was a distinguished elegance in his greying temples, and the smile that had rarely appeared in the early years of marriage now came easily. "It's Christmas Eve," replied Isidora, leaning against his chest. "And they know you promised to tell the story of the garden after dinner." It was a tradition they had established. Every Christmas Eve, Aurelio told the girls the story of how their mother had restored the abandoned garden, transforming it into the paradise that was now their favorite playground. The ranch had prospered magnificently under Isidora and Aurelio's joint administration. She had established a small school for the workers' children, teaching them to read and write on winter mornings. She had also created a community library where workers could borrow books and where she held weekly readings for anyone who wanted to participate. Aurelio, in turn, had modernized the farm operations, introducing new cattle breeding techniques and diversifying crops. The ranch was now one of the most prosperous in the region, known as much for its efficiency as for its fair treatment of workers. "Mama!" shouted Esperanza from the garden, waving energetically. "Grandma Elena's rosebush has 5 flowers this year." It was true. The original rosebush, which for decades had produced only 1 flower per year, had begun blooming abundantly after Isidora began caring for it. Aurelio said it was because the plant had finally found someone who understood its language. "Let's have breakfast," called Isidora, and the girls ran to the house, their faces pink from the morning air. During breakfast, Constanza asked the question she asked every year. "Papa, tell me again how you and Mama met." It was a story they had decided to tell honestly, adapted for the children's age. They spoke about how sometimes people come into our lives in unexpected ways, how true love can grow even when we start as strangers, and how the courage to tell the truth is always worthwhile. "And Aunt Celeste?" asked Esperanza. "Will she ever come back?" Celeste had left definitively 2 years after the investigation, leaving only a letter explaining that she had decided to start a new life in Europe. Occasionally, postcards arrived from Paris or Rome, always signed simply with C but without a return address. "Maybe someday," Isidora replied diplomatically, "but sometimes people need to find their own story in distant places." After breakfast, the family took a carriage to the village where they would participate in Christmas Mass. It was a tradition they had maintained, and Isidora especially appreciated the walk through the small chapel where she had married 8 years before. The priest was the same, now older and even more nervous, but always greeted them with special affection. "Ah, the Del Sola family," he would say every year. "One of the most blessed marriages I've ever celebrated." During Mass, Isidora held Aurelio's hand, observing their daughters singing Christmas hymns with sweet, clear voices. There was a completeness in her life that sometimes surprised her with its intensity. In the afternoon, while the girls napped and Aurelio reviewed accounts in the library, Isidora walked alone through the garden. It was her annual moment of reflection, when she walked the paths she had created and remembered the woman she had been when she first arrived there. The fountain in the center had been restored and now sang softly, surrounded by perfectly tended flower beds. There were new additions over the years: a small greenhouse where she cultivated rare seedlings, a lavender grove that perfumed the entire valley when it bloomed, and a special corner where she had planted wildflowers from the region. But it was the 2 rose bushes, Elena's original and the one she and Aurelio had planted together, that always captured her attention. They grew side by side now, their roots probably intertwined underground, their crowns forming a single mass of foliage and flowers. Beside them, 2 wooden stakes carried their inscriptions. The original, "In memory of Elena del Solar, who planted beauty where she found only earth," and the new, "To the woman I didn't expect, but should always have found, December 1881. That night, after dinner and the promised story, after the girls had been put to bed with kisses and promises of presents the next day, Isidora and Aurelio retired to their room. It was Christmas Eve, but it was also the 8th anniversary of the night they had first declared their love. As he always did on this date, Aurelio had left a white rose on Isidora's pillow, a tradition he had maintained religiously since that first flower he had cut from his mother's rosebush. 8 years, she murmured, holding the flower against her chest. 8 years since we discovered that sometimes we receive exactly what we need, even when it's not what we expected, he replied, pulling her into his arms. Through the open window, they could see the garden bathed in moonlight, the rose bushes swaying gently in the night breeze. Somewhere in the house, one of the girls murmured something in her sleep, and Remedios, now with completely white hair, but still governing the kitchen with a firm hand, closed a door on the lower floor. "Do you regret anything?" asked Aurelio, echoing the question he had asked years before. "Nothing," Isadora replied without hesitation. "Every choice, every moment of fear, every instant of happiness, everything brought us here. And if you could send a message to the woman who climbed those chapel steps that winter day, what would you say?" Isadora thought for a moment, observing the rose in her hands. "I would tell her to have courage, that sometimes the most difficult paths lead to the most beautiful destinations. And that true love is worth any risk we need to take to find it." From outside, as if responding to her words, the wind brought the perfume of night roses, mixed with the aroma of lavender and the promise of rain at dawn. It was the perfume of home, of family, of the life they had built together from a lie that had become the greatest truth of their lives. In the weeks that would follow, an official letter would arrive informing them that Esteban Rinaldi had died in prison, definitively closing the last chapter of threat to their past. The ranch would continue prospering, the girls would grow strong and intelligent, and the garden would bloom year after year as a living symbol that beauty can emerge even from the most difficult circumstances. But on that Christmas Eve night of 1889, Isadora and Aurelio simply embraced in silence, two hearts that had found their perfect melody in the shared rhythm of their breathing and in the absolute knowledge that, against all odds, they had found in each other not just a companion, but the home of their souls. The last thing Isadora saw before falling asleep was the white rose on her bedside table, its petals open like a star in the darkness, promising that love, once planted in fertile soil, blooms eternally.